according to my data research, a 2% decline in oil consumption in China last year. Your opening thoughts, Clyde, regarding the outlook for the year ahead with the reopening of China, particularly focused on oil demand and oil imports?
Well, I think the thing that I would say first off is it's never as simple as the market narrative would like it to be. Markets love simple narratives, and then simple narrative is China reopening from COVID, bullish for oil prices, bullish for demand, everything's going to be hunky-dory. I've seen some absolutely ridiculous figures that China reopening is going to add 4 million barrels a day to global oil demand. That's nuts. Let's just put that out straight away. Even a full reopening wouldn't add anything like that. But I think what you've got to do is you've got to look at the interplay between China's crude oil imports, its product exports, and its inventory levels. The Chinese have been in the past few years building inventories very heavily. Even last year, when prices rocketed in the wake of the Ukraine war, they were still building inventories. By my calculations, up in the first 11 months, they were adding about 700,000 barrels a day. Now, there's a point at coming, and I think that point is basically now, where they don't really need to add any more to inventories. So what you're then going forward saying is, what is the base for China's oil demand? You've got about 4 million barrels a day, touch more of domestic output, and you've got about 10 million barrels a day currently of imports that vary slightly either side. Is that the base level? And I think that's probably a fair assumption, because if you look at it, they're refining between 13.5 and 14 million barrels a day. There is an opportunity to increase that. They'd certainly have some spare capacity in that system. But what we're really saying is you now actually have to look at domestic fuel demand and how much China wants to export, and then work it out going backwards from that. So
I mean, we are still 2 million barrels down, according to my research, from pre-COVID levels. We were at about 15.5 going into the COVID crisis of oil demand consumption in China. It dropped down to a little bit above 13. What's your sense of those numbers, and where do you see it recovering this year?
I think the recovery will be more modest than people expect. I think, if you actually look at the PMI numbers in China, they're not crash hot. You're expecting a slower Europe, you're expecting a slowdown in America, you're expecting a whole range of not such good outcomes for the global economy. China will not be immune to that this time. Yes, they can do a certain amount of stimulus spending, but the parts of their economy that are trade exposed are not probably going to do as well as could be expected. The overall oil demand picture, I expect it will be up slightly, but here's the key. Does that translate into immediately higher imports? That's not what the trade is telling me, quite frankly. We all know oil's bought months and months in advance. Oil bought today will actually probably run through a refinery in June. So I'm not seeing a huge tick up in physical demand for crude from China. So I think you've got to look at it from that perspective is, are we going to see a big increase? I don't think so. I think the Chinese like to, unlike the Americans who talk all the time about the SPR, and we all love talking about what they're doing with it, the Chinese actually use their SPR, they just don't talk about it. So, they're quite happy to use inventories, either commercial or strategic, if they feel prices have gone too far. So basically it comes down to a price thing. If prices go back above $90 a barrel for Brent, I think you're going to see the Chinese get reluctant to buy that much. Any
old habits, I suppose. Albert, there's the key question is, I don't think we've ever, there's always a question mark about data out of everywhere, and certainly data out of China, but we've never had a bigger gap in the perception of the reality on the ground right now in China vis-a-vis how significantly difficult this reopening, this sudden shocking abandonment of zero COVID. I think the Chinese data, official data, is something like 25 deaths from COVID infections. And meanwhile, something in the region like 800 million people have been affected in the last month. So there's this huge gap. And the World Health Organization has even acknowledged it, etc. So my question to you is, try to bring some reality to us in the wider world, this gap between the official data and the perception. What does it feel like on the ground? Is it going to be a quick opening, or will it be very messy for a number of months?
Oh, there's so many questions there. Look,
Yeah.
I listened to your interview with Ben Simpfendorfer, and he
Yeah.
answered some of these same questions very, very well. Yes, the statistics are far from reliable coming from the Chinese government today. The anecdotally, what we hear from our friends in Shanghai and Beijing and Xiamen is an infection rate closing on about 100%. Everyone is sick. Now, is probably less than that, but that's perception on the ground because very few people are escaping the infection, right? And there is a high death rate, as evidenced again anecdotally by bodies piling up in the mortuaries awaiting cremation. So those numbers are not being reported. China has in fact changed the definition of a COVID death to purely a pneumonia related death. And on that basis, if you took the US numbers, it would be like 66,000 people in the US died from COVID by that definition. So, you can change the game in the middle, I suppose, but the situation here is quite serious, right? Everyone is masked. Everyone's taking this very, very seriously. I have the good fortune of living in Hainan, which is relatively a healthy place, but not immune. So I don't have firsthand on the ground answers to your question, but I do have them from our friends.
Well, I suppose the question, as Victor indicated in his opening comment, that people getting back to travel, back to tourism, back to exposing themselves, and the question is how quickly will that happen in terms of, because the big question really, Victor, is domestic consumption in China, right? People going out spending. That's why I asked you in my opening comment, what are you doing now that you weren't able to do a month ago? Are you going to restaurants? Are you getting into taxis? Are you consuming again in a way that would increase energy consumption?
Yes, well, you can travel without any restriction now.
But are people doing so? Are people doing so?
Only, a small number at present, not the majority yet. But in the coming weeks, because of the Spring Festival travel rush, the majority, say hundreds of millions, will be traveling back to their hometowns. And some haven't been home for 2 years or even 3 years. So this is a great opportunity. And as you said before, actually we have seen peaking infections in December, very fast. Almost, everyone got the virus in December. Maybe not everyone, but the majority
of
the Chinese people. Yes, I got and recovered in about 3 days. And so everyone in my office too, and including almost everyone in Beijing, my colleagues, and other places too. So it spread very quickly in December. So basically, we had passed the first wave of outbreaks in December. And now people are gradually taking it, had accepted this one now. So they are less concerned about the virus now. And they are gradually resuming normal life. Yes, that's the basics on the ground now.
Thank you. Clyde, we're looking at the sort of the peak oil concept, peak oil demand concept in China. If we are in and around 15 million barrels pre-COVID, 15.5 million barrels a day, and we've seen a serious decline in economic activity, of course, with the lockdowns and everything else. But my question is to you regarding refining capacity in China. Refining capacity in China is at about 20 million barrels a day, and it's set to even grow by another 2 million barrels with refineries under construction. What happens with that gap, that domestic 15 and the 5-7 extra million barrels? Are we going to see, as part of the recovery, a massive surge in oil products exports out of China, do you think?
Well, I think that a lot of that depends on the pricing and what the economic imperatives are for the authorities in Beijing at any given time. Right now, they're boosting exports quite dramatically, but this is it's a cheap, easy economic win for them. They get to run their refineries harder. That creates economic activity, and they get to capture some of those very high margins, especially for diesel in regional and even in markets as far away as Europe. So for them, that makes sense. On the broader sort of trend thing, thing. Yes, we are expecting China to add a few more refineries still. I think what we don't look at the other end of that equation, which is how many of the older ones are being shut. And there's definitely a move to shut down more of what one might have called the teapot refineries, the older teapot refineries. So getting rid of these older, less efficient plants, replacing them with modern ones, whether they're state-owned or actually from some of the larger independent companies. So I think overall, we will see some small increase in China's refining capacity, but not a massive one. Will they use that? Well, that really does depend on the economics of it. I mean, they've shown themselves in the past that they're quite happy to capture profits when they're available, but also to withdraw from the market when they're not. So it's China's not, their product exports they don't operate in the way a Western export-orientated refinery, such as those in Singapore, would do so. They are under, government constraints, and they have to fit in with those policies. So I think it's, I would say always look at the numbers. If they need to stimulate the economy, if there's profits to be had, then yes. But the other thing you've got to remember is, if China does start to use much more of its spare capacity, that will depress the regional product cracks, and it will also, a barrel refined in China simply becomes a barrel not refined somewhere else. So net, it doesn't really change the overall global balances. It just means things are happening in a different place than they happened before. So I think, you got to look at that from a point of view as well. But in general terms, the Chinese have built some very modern, very efficient, world-class refineries, and I would expect them to use that capacity going forward. But it is, it's again.
Well, especially now when you consider that they don't really have access to the same stimulus tools, right? You can't build another road to nowhere, another railroad to nowhere. Refinery exports or product exports does offer a stimulus opportunity win in a way that the old approach doesn't, it seems to me. Albert, I wanted to get your thoughts, speaking a little bit to the bigger picture here in terms of the peak oil concept in China. Obviously, we've got the big narrative in the world. We start 2023 with China reopening, the decoupling story, the idea that the integration of China into the world economy, US and China, the two biggest energy consumers in the world, China being the manufacturing center for everything, most notably in the headlines in recent months, Apple, every iPhone in the world nearly produced in China. But increasingly with the story of manufacturing moving away from China, this decoupling idea, that has a weighting and it gives some sort of legitimacy to the peak oil demand story. If you'd speak to that, your thoughts.
There's been a sharp reduction, Sean, in FDI from OECD sources into China over the past 3 years. It's been correlating with the pandemic, with that capital going to Europe and North America. And that correlates with a reshoring of a number of foreign-owned assets in China to more capital-friendly environments. Vietnam kind of seems to top the list in Southeast Asia for that reshoring business. So there's been a net reduction of manufacturing capacity in China due to the pandemic itself and the shuttering of plants, as well as the reshoring of operations to other countries, which offer a better proposition. With the return of air travel, domestic at first, a bit of international, and eventually the opening to tourism again in China, you can expect oil demand to snap back by 1 to 1.5 million barrels over the course of the year. It's not going to be instantaneous by any means, but say by year end, perhaps 1.5 million barrels of transportation fuels for air transportation and an additional amount for ground transportation, mostly private automobiles. The balance of the crude oil goes to producing energy for industry and electrical power generation. So where is peak oil? As I started to say earlier, it's peaking now. Peak oil demand is occurring today, and it's been occurring now for a number of years. It's being replaced by natural gas and sustained by coal, and as well by expansion of wind and nuclear and hydro in China. So there is kind of a stable level of oil demand that will continue for the ensuing years. But at the same time, China is actually trying to diminish its reliance on oil imports using its own domestic production and other energy sources as they kind of move toward their zero carbon goals.
Albert, just to speak on that decoupling point, the geopolitics around it, of course, over the last few years during lockdown, COVID, supply chain disruptions, and so forth, there was a lot of, it was easy to say, yeah, I'm getting the hell out of China, I'm moving back to Ohio, when the economic opportunity was stuttering in China. But now China reopens, the government puts in massive stimulus, makes it really easy to come back and make lots of money. How bedded in, from your perspective, do you think the decoupling is in a full boom China versus the last few years, which has been, stumbly and easy to say, yeah, I'm getting out of here?
That's going to be an interesting mixture, I think. Look, there's been a wake-up call here to the global community that the offshoring of capacity was not, as kind of a total solution, was not a great idea. And it's time to bring some supply chain security back home again. But at the same time, capital moves to capital-friendly environments. And if China were to make those concessions and create an environment that was very favorable to foreign investment, it will return. But it will return over years, not months. So anyone looking at China's recovery as simply a snapback to the pre-pandemic trends, I think is a bit naive. It's a different economy now, and it's going to be a different trajectory.
Victor, the other big argument about peak oil demand is the substitution for combustion engine cars, vehicles to electric vehicles, which of course we've seen a big upsurge in China. In the fourth quarter last year, data shows China had a total of about a little over 400 million vehicles, of which 75% were passenger vehicles, and an increasingly, but still somewhat small number, were electric vehicles, something in the region of 8 million electric vehicles on the road in China, but growing at a double-digit rate. I'm wondering, from your perspective, does electric vehicles become a significant game changer for, obviously, most of oil consumption in China, like everywhere else, is for transport, and electric vehicles will eat into that business?
Yes, well, it would be a very important factor eroding gasoline demand. But gasoline demand will still be growing modestly in the coming years until around 2025 because the sales of traditional automobiles are still growing. Well, it's growing slower, but still growing. And we can still see a modest recovery in gasoline demand in the coming years until 2025. And more shares will be taken by EVs, natural gas, and some other alternative energy. That's for sure. And the country is now, as Russell said just now, is trying to reduce its dependence on fossil fuel. So it's developing hydropower, other alternative energy went fast. So this is a general trend. Yes.
I want to just also recognize that we have a few hundred people watching this at the moment on LinkedIn and also on Twitter. So we welcome that audience. And if any questions or comments, please do post them on LinkedIn or Twitter. But just for the last final comment with this panel, I wanted to get a very sort of focused outlook for the year ahead, exactly where you think China goes, and with it, oil demand and imports. Is it a year of two halves? How do you see it, Clyde, specific year ahead, 2023, China, as it reopens?
I think it will be a year.
Let's go to Clyde first. Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it'll be a year of many halves. And I know that sounds stupid, but I think you're going to see an initial little boost once we're over this COVID issue. And then we're going to have to see how the rest of the year plays out vis-a-vis the global economy and things like that. Overall, I expect China's oil demand and imports to rise, but probably by nowhere near as much as the most bullish forecasts out there in the market.
But what would that number be for you, Clyde? I mean, there's a general consensus around 1 million in terms of consumption increase in China this year, 1 million barrels a day.
I think around 1 million would be reasonable. The question is whether that is met all by imports or not, or whether some of it comes from already built up inventories, or from fewer or lower product exports. Those are the factors that are still up in the mix. And I think the driving factor for that is the price of crude. If it gets above 90, China won't buy much more than it already is. If it stays below 80, below 70, they're going to rather import than use up their stockpiles.
Because they've still got very, very high levels of inventory from the COVID years.
They do, and they've also largely filled their strategic stockpiles. They don't need to fill any more. So, you know, they've got the opportunity, they've got the flexibility. The one thing I can guarantee you is they won't talk about it, they'll just do it. So you've got to watch what is actually happening in the physical flows market.
Albert, your thoughts on 2023 China reopening?
Look, I think Clyde has said it very well here. I would put the number at about 1.5 million barrels a day, but not on the full year. I would say by year end 2023, oil demand from external oil demand will have risen by about 1.5 million barrels a day. From there, who knows? We have to really kind of assess the trends that develop over the course of 2023.
Would you subscribe to the general narrative that China is facing a year of two halves? It'll take 6 months for the reopening to sort of find its legs, and the second half will be where you'll start to see something resembling pre-COVID.
I don't think it won't resemble pre-COVID by any means. It's a new beginning rather than a recovery. And I do agree with that assessment that the second half of the year will tell the story for 2023, not so much the first 6 months.
Victor, do you get the last word this morning on your outlook for China in 2023?
Yes, as Clyde said, and Evan too. Well, demand is expected to grow modestly and not very sharply as well. Clyde said we have built up a lot of stockpiles of crude oil in the past few years, even last year. And one important factor is prices. And imports can grow by, say, about 3% if the prices are not too high this year. And its crude ones is also rebounding too. We had 2 large refineries coming online at the end of last year. One is 400,000 barrels per day, and the other is slightly above 300,000 barrels per day. And another one is coming online late next year, 400,000 barrels per day. And the removal of all refineries, as Clyde said, is going on, but it's not slowing down. So the new refineries will push up the crude ones modestly in the coming years when the country slows down the removal of old ones. You know, local governments are under a lot of pressure to develop their economy. And so they are reluctant to move fast with the removal of old refineries now. And, you know, in the past few years, local governments have been deeply in debt. So they need to struggle and they need to try hard to develop the economies. Yes.
They're certainly going to be under a lot of pressure. This sort of regional versus central government in China is a whole nother dynamic, I think, to watch during this coming year, given the stress that was in that relationship during the imposition of the zero COVID policy. We have to leave it there. We have India waiting to come and onto the stage and give us an outlook for India, which of course is the big optimistic story in East Asia last year. But first, I'd like to thank Albert Stromquist, Victor Yang, and Clyde Russell for their insights and outlook for China in 2023. But we'll wrap up this session and thank the hundreds watching online and encourage everybody to plug into the interview coming up with India's Narendra Taneja.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.